Breaking all survival rules in the wilderness, a combat veteran in Montana opened his cabin door to a starving wolf and her pups during the deadliest blizzard in decades. What happened in the months that followed left wildlife experts and locals completely speechless. The mercury in Daniel Blackwood's outdoor thermometer had plummeted to 30 degrees below zero, and the needle showed no signs of stopping its descent. In his 7 years living in this remote corner of Montana's Bitterroot Mountains, he had weathered brutal winters before, but nothing like the merciless cold front sweeping down from Canada this January night. Weather reports called it a once-in-a-century impolar vortex, but such clinical terms failed to capture the raw, primal danger of air so cold it crystallized the moisture in your lungs with each breath. Daniel stood at his cabin window, watching ice crystals form intricate patterns across the glass as his breath fogged the pane. Outside, the world had vanished beneath swirling curtains of snow, illuminated only by the pale blue moonlight that occasionally pierced the storm clouds. His nearest neighbor was 17 miles away. Not that anyone could traverse such a distance. In these conditions, the mountain pass connecting his property to the small town of White River would be completely impassable by now. "Looks like it's just us tonight," Daniel murmured to his German shepherd Atlas, who lay sprawled before the wood stove, the orange glow of embers reflecting in his watchful eyes. The dog's ears perked at his master's voice, but he made no move to leave the warmth. Daniel couldn't blame him. At 42, Daniel had built a life defined by solitude and self-reliance. The walls of his hand-built cabin bore few decorations beyond practical items: topographical maps of the surrounding wilderness, a barometer, a vintage rifle that had belonged to his grandfather, and a single framed photograph of his former Marine unit in Afghanistan. 3 tours of combat had left him with both visible and invisible scars, a jagged line across his left forearm, and the sort of hypervigilance that made crowded spaces feel like minefields. When he'd returned home after his final deployment, the suburban neighborhood where he'd grown up felt suffocating. Too many people, too many noises, too many unexpected stimuli that sent his heart racing and his mind spiraling back to dust-choked streets half a world away. So he'd used his savings to purchase 80 acres of remote forest land and built his cabin by hand. Here, the dangers were straightforward: weather, wildlife, isolation. These threats he could prepare for could meet with clear-eyed pragmatism rather than the paralyzing hyper-arousal that haunted him in civilization. His daily routine was carefully structured around survival and self-sufficiency. Each morning began with checking weather conditions, tending to his modest livestock, 6 chickens and 2 goats housed in a sturdy outbuilding, and performing maintenance on his solar panels, generator, and water collection system. The discipline of military life had transferred well to wilderness living. His pantry was meticulously organized, with enough preserved food to last months, and his medical supplies would have impressed an emergency room nurse. The storm had been forecast days in advance, giving Daniel ample time to prepare. He'd chopped extra firewood, moved it to the covered porch in neat stacks, and secured his outbuildings with additional supports against the expected wind. His satellite phone was fully charged, though he doubted emergency services could reach him if things went truly south. Self-reliance wasn't just a philosophy out here, it was the only option. Atlas suddenly lifted his head, ears forward, body tense. A moment later, Daniel heard what had alerted his companion, a sound barely distinguishable from the howling wind, yet unmistakably different. A high-pitched whine, followed by a deeper, guttural sound that made the hair on his arms stand up. Despite the cabin's warmth, "You hear that too, huh?" Daniel said softly, moving toward the window again. Atlas rose to his feet, hackles raised, a low growl building in his throat. Daniel grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight from the hook by the door and directed its beam through the window. At first he saw nothing but the hypnotic dance of snowflakes. caught in the light. Then a shadow moved against the white backdrop, something large and dark, struggling through drifts that reached halfway up his porch steps. The beam caught a reflection of eyes, amber orbs glowing in the darkness like twin flames, wolf eyes. Daniel had encountered the local wolf packs before, usually at a respectful distance during his hunting excursions. They typically avoided human habitation, especially one accompanied by the scent of dog. Something was very wrong if wolves were approaching his cabin. As the creature moved closer, Daniel could make out more details. It was indeed a wolf, a large female, her grey, coat matted with ice and snow. Her movements were labored, each step appearing to cost tremendous effort. Behind her, barely visible in the whiteout conditions, smaller shapes struggled to follow in her trail. Wolf pups, Daniel whispered in disbelief. In January. Wolf pups were typically born in spring, not the dead of winter. These must be from last year's litter, still dependent on their mother, but old enough to travel with the pack. Speaking of which, where was the rest of the pack? Wolves were intensely social animals. A lone wolf with pups was highly unusual. The mother wolf reached his bottom porch step and collapsed, her strength seemingly exhausted. The pups, Daniel counted 3 of them, huddled against her, their small bodies shivering violently as they sought warmth from their mother's failing body heat. Even from inside, Daniel could see their ribs protruding beneath thin, juvenile coats. They were starving. Atlas paced anxiously by the door, alternating between barking and whining, his instincts clearly conflicted between territorial defense and distress at the sight of suffering canids, distant evolutionary cousins to his own kind. Easy boy, Daniel commanded, though his own mind raced with conflicting imperatives. Every wilderness manual, every piece of outdoor training he'd received, emphasized a cardinal rule: never invite wild predators into your space, especially apex. Predators like wolves. Even weakened by cold and hunger, a cornered wolf could inflict terrible damage, and Atlas's presence complicated matters further. Dogs and wolves had complex, often hostile interactions. Yet as Daniel watched, one of the pups collapsed entirely, no longer moving except for the rapid, shallow rise and fall of its small ribcage. The mother wolf, hearing her offspring's distress, attempted to rise but could only lift her head, releasing a mournful howl that pierced Daniel straight through. In that sound, he heard something hauntingly familiar, the same desperation he'd heard in the voices of comrades calling for medics on the battlefield. A living being pushed beyond endurance, fighting not for itself, but for those it was responsible for protecting. "Damn it," Daniel muttered, already knowing what he was going to do, despite every logical argument against it. He moved quickly, gathering supplies. First, he secured Atlas in the bedroom with a firm command to stay, closing the door despite the dog's protesting whines. Then he pulled on his extreme weather gear: insulated pants, his military-grade parka, heavy gloves, and a balaclava that left only his eyes exposed. Finally, he grabbed several thick wool blankets from his emergency supplies. The thermometer now read 35 below. Exposure at these temperatures could kill within minutes. He took a deep breath and opened the door, immediately feeling the brutal assault of the elements. The wind stole his breath away as he stepped onto the porch, carefully navigating the ice-slicked boards. The wolves were only a few feet away now, the mother's eyes tracking his movement with the last reserves of her strength. Daniel had faced armed insurgents with less trepidation than he felt approaching these wild animals. The mother wolf's lips pulled back slightly, revealing teeth designed for tearing flesh. Despite her weakness, she was preparing to defend her young with her last breath if necessary. "I'm not going to hurt them," Daniel said softly, knowing the wolf couldn't understand his words, but hoping his tone might convey his intentions. "But we need to move fast, or none of you will make it through the night." He carefully tossed a blanket so it landed near but not directly on the wolf family. The mother flinched but didn't snap or growl. Her eyes remained fixed on Daniel, evaluating, calculating through the haze of her exhaustion. The cabin had a mud room, a small enclosed space between the main living area and the outside world, designed to keep dirt, snow, and cold air from entering the main house. It was barely 8 feet by 6 feet, with a concrete floor and sturdy walls. If Daniel could get the wolves into this space, they would be sheltered from the killing cold without having direct access to his living quarters. He spread another blanket from the porch to create a path, then slowly, deliberately placed a third blanket inside the mudroom, leaving its door wide open. Warm air flowed out, creating a pocket of relief in the frozen night. The smallest pup had stopped moving entirely. With heart pounding, Daniel made a decision that contradicted every survival instinct. He approached slowly, telegraphing his movements, and reached for the motionless pup. The mother growled, a deep rumble of warning despite her weakness. Daniel paused, looking directly into her amber eyes. "He'll die if I don't help," he said firmly. "You all will." Whether it was his tone, the extreme circumstances, or some impossible communication between species, the mother wolf did not attack when Daniel gently lifted the smallest pup. The tiny body was frighteningly cold, its pulse faint and rapid beneath his fingers. He quickly moved the pup into the mudroom, wrapping it more securely in the waiting blanket. Then he returned for the second pup, who weakly resisted before succumbing to handling. The third pup, slightly larger than its siblings, bared small teeth, but was too weak to do more as Daniel transferred it to the relative warmth of the mudroom. Only the mother remained, her massive form now partially covered by drifting snow. She made one valiant attempt to stand, failed, then tried again, her powerful legs trembling with the effort. Daniel stood back, giving her space to make her own way. With extraordinary determination, she dragged herself forward, following the scent of her pups up the steps and across the porch. At the threshold of the mudroom, she stopped, her instincts warring with necessity. Beyond her offspring lay the den of a human, everything her wild nature recognized as danger. "It's this, or freeze to death," Daniel told her quietly. "Your choice." For a long moment, neither moved. Then, with a grunt of effort, the mother wolf hauled herself into the mudroom, immediately collapsing beside her pups, her massive body curling around them protectively. Her eyes, fixed on Daniel, held neither gratitude nor trust, only wary exhaustion and the fierce resolve of a mother. Daniel closed the outer door, sealing out the lethal cold, then hesitated before closing the inner door that led to his living quarters. The wolves were now sheltered, but still dangerously cold. Inside his cabin, he quickly gathered more supplies, a space heater, water bowls, and after a moment's consideration, some of the venison he'd harvested and frozen months earlier. Atlas scratched at the bedroom door, his whines growing more insistent, as he detected the scent of strange wolves in his territory. "Sorry, buddy," Daniel called. "Not now." When he returned to the mudroom, the scene was unchanged, except that the smallest pup had begun to shiver again. A good sign, as it meant the body was fighting to generate heat. Daniel cautiously set up the space heater at a safe distance, plugged it in, and adjusted it to a moderate setting. "Too much heat too fast can be as dangerous as the cold," he explained to the watchful mother. "We need to warm you all gradually." He placed the water and meat just within reach of the mother. Wolf then backed away toward the inner door. For tonight, at least, he would sleep with this barrier between himself and the wild predators he'd just invited into his home. As he prepared to close the door, Daniel looked at the wolf family one more time. The mother's eyes were growing heavy as the warmth began to penetrate her frozen coat, but they still tracked his every movement. There was something in that gaze, a complex intelligence assessing him, memorizing him. "Dawn will be here in about 7 hours, Daniel told her. "We'll figure out the next step then." He closed the inner door, secured it with a wooden bar, and leaned his forehead against the solid oak. The enormity of what he'd just done washed over him. He'd violated the most basic principles of wilderness survival, potentially endangering himself and Atlas for the sake of wild predators. Creatures that, under normal circumstances, would view him as either threat or prey. Atlas's whining had escalated to urgent barking. Daniel returned to the bedroom and opened the door, immediately taking a firm hold of the dog's collar. I know, he soothed as Atlas strained toward the mudroom. But they're staying behind that door, and you're staying with me tonight. As he settled into his bed that night, Atlas reluctantly curled up beside him rather than in his usual spot by the wood stove. Daniel listened to the storm's continued assault on his cabin. Occasionally, he heard sounds from the mudroom, the shuffle of movement, a soft whine from one of the pups, the deep sigh of the mother wolf. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for tonight at least, all the living creatures under. His roof was safe from the killing cold. Daniel drifted to sleep with his hand resting on Atlas's fur, wondering what dawn would reveal about the desperate wolf family seeking shelter in his home, and what consequences his moment of compassion might ultimately bring. Daniel woke before dawn, the habits of military life and wilderness survival deeply ingrained in his body clock. For a brief, disoriented moment, he wondered why Atlas was pressed so tightly against him instead of sleeping in his usual spot by the stove. Then the events of the previous night cascaded back into his consciousness. Wolves in his mudroom. He sat up quickly, startling Atlas, who had been watching him with unusual intensity. The dog's ears were perked forward, his body tense with alertness. From beyond the bedroom, Daniel could hear faint sounds of movement. Easy, he murmured to Atlas, scratching behind the dog's ears while maintaining a firm grip on his collar. We're going to handle this carefully. The cabin's main room was still warm, the wood stove having retained enough heat through the night. Through the frost-edged windows, Daniel could see that the storm had subsided somewhat, though snow continued to fall in large, lazy flakes. The wind had died down from its howling fury to an occasional moan around the cabin's eaves. The thermometer outside his window now read 20 below zero, still dangerously cold, but an improvement from the night before. Daniel secured Atlas to the heavy oak dining table with a length of rope, enough to let the dog move comfortably, but not reach the mudroom door. Atlas whined in protest, but settled when Daniel gave the firm command to stay. Years of training had created a bond of trust between them, even when the dog's instincts pulled in another direction. After stoking the fire and putting coffee on to brew, Daniel approached the mudroom door cautiously, pressing his ear against the wood. He could hear movement, scratching sounds, the soft whimpering of the pups, a heavier shuffling that must be the mother wolf adjusting her position. At least they were all still alive. Daniel had spent enough time tracking and observing wolves to understand their behavior, but inviting them into his home was uncharted territory. The mother would be protective, potentially more dangerous in the confined space than she would be in the wild. Yet leaving them outside would have meant certain death in the extreme cold. He retrieved a package of venison from his deep freeze, meat from a deer he'd hunted the previous fall. Thawing it slightly in the microwave, he cut several chunks, placing them in a metal bowl. He filled another bowl with fresh water, then took a deep breath before sliding the wooden bar from the mudroom door. Atlas growled low in his throat as Daniel eased the door open just enough to peer inside. The space heater still hummed steadily, having maintained a temperature well above freezing throughout the night. The wolf family had arranged themselves in the far corner, as distant from the door as the small space allowed. The mother lay curled around her pups, her massive head lifting immediately at Daniel's appearance. Her amber eyes locked onto his with laser focus, but she made no aggressive move. The smallest pup still looked worryingly weak, but all three were now conscious and huddled against their mother's warmth. The middle pup whimpered softly, tucking its muzzle beneath the mother's front leg at the sight of the human. "Just bringing breakfast," Daniel said quietly, maintaining eye contact with the mother wolf as he slowly placed the bowls just inside the door. "I'm going to check on the little one, if you'll let me." The mother's upper lip twitched slightly, revealing a glimpse of formidable canines. But she remained in place as Daniel inched forward in a crouch, making himself appear smaller, less threatening. The untouched meat and water from the night before remained where he'd left them. The wolves had been too cold, too wary to eat. Daniel stopped a few feet away, extending his hand palm down in a gesture that had always calmed nervous dogs. The mother wolf's nostrils flared as she scented him, her gaze unwavering. Behind him, Atlas gave a single sharp bark of warning. "It's okay," Daniel called over his shoulder, never taking his eyes off the wolf. "We're just getting acquainted." Whether it was the tone of his voice or some imperceptible signal between them, the mother wolf relaxed her posture slightly. She nudged the smallest pup, who had been hidden beneath her massive paw. The tiny wolf rolled limply onto its side, its breathing shallow and rapid. Daniel's heart sank. Hypothermia, starvation, and exhaustion were a deadly combination. Without veterinary intervention, impossible given the weather and isolation, the pup's chances were slim. Yet Daniel had seen enough battlefield injuries to know that sometimes the will to survive could overcome seemingly impossible odds. "That one needs help," he said softly. "Special care." The mother wolf looked from Daniel to her weakest offspring, then back to Daniel. A low whine escaped her throat, not threatening but plaintive, almost questioning. Years later, Daniel would still be unable to explain exactly what happened in that moment. Some connection between species, perhaps. Predators recognizing each other across the divide of wild and domesticated. Or maybe just the universal language of a parent's desperation to save their young. Whatever it was, the mother wolf did the unthinkable. She nudged the smallest pup toward Daniel with her nose. Moving with deliberate slowness, Daniel reached for the tiny wolf. Its body was frighteningly light in his hands, its pulse fluttering weakly beneath his fingers. The pup's eyes, which hadn't yet fully changed from puppy blue to adult amber, opened briefly, regarding him with exhausted confusion before closing again. "I'm going to warm this one up and see if I can get some food into him," Daniel told the mother wolf, backing carefully toward the door. "You should eat too. Build your strength." The mother watched him retreat with her weakest offspring, but made no move to stop him. The two remaining pups pressed closer to her, their small bodies still trembling occasionally. As Daniel carried the pup into the main room, Atlas lunged against his restraint, barking sharply. The dying pup in Daniel's hands flinched at the sound, but lacked the strength for any further reaction. "Atlas, quiet," Daniel commanded firmly. "This one's not a threat to anyone." He moved to the wood stove, where he'd arranged blankets in a makeshift nest atop a cedar chest at a safe distance from the direct heat. Gently, he placed the pup in this warm spot, noting with growing concern how the small creature simply lay where positioned, lacking the strength even to curl into a protective ball. Daniel had treated wounded military working dogs in Afghanistan when their handlers were injured or when veterinary assistance was delayed. Drawing on this experience, he mixed a solution of warm water, some powdered electrolytes from his medical supplies, and a small amount of pureed venison into a paste thin enough to administer with a kitchen baster. "Let's see if you'll take this," he murmured, carefully opening the pup's mouth and placing a few drops of the mixture on its tongue. For several tense moments, the pup made no response. Then its throat moved in a weak swallow. Encouraged, Daniel continued the slow process of administering the liquid meal, drop by drop. Atlas watched from his tethered position, his initial aggression gradually shifting to curious whining as he observed his master's careful ministrations. After almost an hour of patient feeding, the pup had consumed a surprising amount of the mixture, Its breathing had steadied somewhat, though it remained alarmingly weak. Daniel gently examined the small body, finding no obvious injuries, but noting the pronounced ribs and spine, indicating severe malnutrition. Based on its size, he estimated the pup to be about 8 months old enough to have been weaned, but still dependent on the pack for survival. Sudden cacophony of growls and barking from the mudroom sent Daniel hurrying to check on the other wolves, the weak pup cradled against his chest. He opened the door to find the mother wolf standing rigidly facing the outside door, her hackles raised and teeth bared. The two stronger pups had wedged themselves beneath a bench against the wall, their small bodies quivering with fear. Through the mud room's small window, Daniel saw the cause of their alarm. A massive bull moose was moving through his yard, its enormous rack of antlers swaying as it plowed through snowdrifts. Moose were common in these mountains and normally posed no particular threat to humans who kept a respectful distance. But the extreme weather had clearly driven this one dangerously close to the cabin, in search of food or shelter, and few animals in the wilderness were more unpredictable or dangerous than a stressed moose. "Just passing through," Daniel said. Quietly, though he moved to ensure that both the inner and outer doors of the mudroom were securely fastened. A charging moose could easily break through the outer door if provoked. The mother wolf's stance remained alert, her focus entirely on the massive herbivore outside. Daniel noted with interest that she had finally consumed the meat he'd left the night before. The bowl was empty and licked clean. The two pups continued to cower, but their eyes tracked every movement of their mother and the strange human who now held their sibling. As the moose disappeared into the tree line, the mother wolf gradually relaxed her aggressive stance. Her attention returned to Daniel, or more specifically, to the limp form of her weakest pup in his arms. She approached cautiously, her movements stiff with residual tension from the moose encounter. Daniel knelt slowly, allowing the mother to inspect her offspring. Her massive head dwarfed the pup as she sniffed it thoroughly, her breath warm against Daniel's hands. After a moment, she raised her eyes to his face, holding his gaze with an intensity that seemed to communicate across species barriers. "He's a little stronger," Daniel told her, "but he needs more care." Whether she understood his words or merely his intent, the mother wolf stepped back slightly, creating space between them rather than attempting to reclaim her pup. It was a gesture of trust so profound that Daniel felt its weight like a physical thing. "Thank you," he said softly. The next several hours established a strange routine in the isolated cabin. Daniel continued to feed the weakest pup small amounts of the nutrient mixture, gradually increasing the concentration of meat. As the tiny wolf showed signs of improvement, Atlas remained tethered but had settled somewhat, watching the proceedings with canine curiosity rather than aggression. In the mudroom, the mother wolf and her two stronger pups gradually relaxed enough to eat and drink properly. Daniel provided fresh water and more venison, maintaining a respectful distance but speaking calmly to them whenever he entered. The pups remained wary, darting beneath the bench at his appearance, but the mother had begun to acknowledge his presence with a subtle tail movement, not quite a wag, but a recognition that fell short of hostility. By mid-afternoon, the weakest pup was showing remarkable improvement. Its eyes remained open for longer periods, tracking Daniel's movements around the cabin. It had even attempted to stand once, though its legs had quickly buckled beneath it. Daniel had constructed a more substantial nest from an old wooden crate, lined with blankets, placing it near enough to the stove for warmth, but not so close as to overheat the recovering animal. Outside, the storm had finally abated, leaving behind a crystalline landscape of unbroken white. The thermometer had risen to a relatively mild 5 degrees below zero, still dangerous, but no longer immediately life-threatening. Daniel knew He needed to consider next steps. The wolves couldn't remain in his home indefinitely, yet releasing them too soon would likely condemn them, especially the weakened pup. As the short winter day faded toward an early dusk, Daniel made his decision. He would construct a temporary shelter in his covered woodshed, a space that offered protection from the elements while remaining separate from his living quarters. It would serve as a transition, allowing the wolf family to regain strength before facing the full challenges of the wilderness again. Moving with purpose, Daniel gathered tools and materials from his storage area. He was measuring lumber when a sharp, frantic barking from Atlas drew his attention back to the cabin's main room. The dog was straining against his tether, hackles raised as he faced the mudroom door. Daniel rushed inside to find the door ajar. He must have failed to secure it properly during his last check on the wolves. The main room appeared empty at first glance, but Atlas's barking remained directed at the shadows beneath Daniel's desk in the far corner. There, barely visible in the dimness, glowed two pairs of small, frightened eyes. The stronger wolf pups had somehow worked up the courage to venture into the main cabin while their mother wasn't watching. Now, confronted by the aggressive barking of a dog nearly their own size, they were frozen with terror. "Atlas, quiet!" Daniel commanded sharply. The dog immediately ceased barking but remained tense, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Daniel moved slowly toward the desk, crouching to make himself less intimidating. The pups pressed themselves against the wall, small teeth bared in fear rather than aggression. From the mudroom came a deep, worried whine as the mother wolf realized her offspring had wandered into potential danger. "It's okay," Daniel said soothingly, addressing both Atlas and the trembling pups. "Nobody's gonna hurt anybody here." He reached out slowly, allowing the pups to sniff his hand, the hand that carried the scent of their sibling, the weakest one he'd been nursing back to health. After a tense moment, the larger of the two pups cautiously stretched its muzzle toward his fingers, nostrils flaring as it processed his scent. That simple gesture of curiosity overcoming fear marked another threshold crossed. Daniel smiled as the pup's cold nose touched his skin, followed a moment later by the hesitant approach of its sibling. "Welcome to the strangest den in Montana," he told them quietly. "Now, let's get you back to your mother before she tears down the door." As if on cue, a more urgent whine came from the mudroom, accompanied by the sound of claws scratching at wood. Daniel gently herded the adventurous pups back toward the door, marveling at how quickly the barriers between human and wild were eroding in this unexpected arrangement. What had begun as an emergency intervention was evolving into something far more complex, a temporary alliance between species that should, by all natural law, remain wary strangers at best. Daniel couldn't yet know how this unusual situation would resolve, or what consequences might flow from his decision to bring predators into his home. But as he watched the pups scamper back to their anxious mother, he felt certain of one thing. He had made the right choice on that freezing night. The weak pup in its nest by the stove lifted its head at the commotion, eyes more alert than they had been hours earlier. Its tiny pink tongue emerged to lick its muzzle, a simple gesture that nonetheless signaled returning strength. Daniel nodded to himself, acknowledging the responsibility he had taken on. These wolves would need his help for days, perhaps weeks to come. And after that would be a bridge to cross when they reached it. As night fell on the second day, Daniel completed the makeshift shelter in his woodshed. He had cleared a section of the spacious covered area, constructing a raised platform to keep the wolves off the cold ground. Layers of old blankets and straw created insulation, while strategically positioned tarps formed windbreaks on three sides. It wasn't luxurious, but it would maintain a temperature well above the deadly cold outside, while providing the wolf family with more space than the cramped mudroom. The weakest pup, whom Daniel had begun mentally referring to as Runt, had made remarkable progress throughout the day. It could now stand shakily and had begun lapping diluted broth from a shallow dish rather than requiring the laborious dropper. Feeding. Its eyes tracked movement with growing alertness, and twice it had attempted a wobbly exploration of its blanket nest before exhaustion forced it to rest again. With the shelter prepared, Daniel faced his next challenge, relocating the mother wolf and her two stronger pups. He approached the mudroom with a mixture of caution and established familiarity, speaking softly before opening the door. "Time for a change of scenery," he told the mother wolf, who watched him with her now characteristic intensity. "You'll have more space, but still protection from the cold." The pups were huddled together in their usual corner, but Daniel noted they no longer fled beneath the bench at his appearance. Progress of a sort. The mother rose to her feet, her posture alert but no longer hostile. Days of regular feeding had already begun to fill out her frame, the desperate gauntness giving way to more natural leanness. Daniel laid a trail of venison chunks from the mudroom to the woodshed, not because he expected the wolves to follow, like trained dogs, but to create familiar scent markers along the route. The path required crossing a short stretch of open yard, now covered in knee-deep snow. He stamped down a walkway, making the journey easier for still recovering wolves. With careful movements, Daniel propped the mudroom's exterior door fully open, then retreated to watch from a distance. The mother wolf approached the doorway cautiously, her nostrils flaring at the rush of fresh air laden with wilderness scents. She paused at the threshold, head high, ears swiveling to catch any sound of danger. The pups crowded behind her legs, their curiosity battling with instinctive caution. For long minutes, nothing happened. The wolves remained frozen in indecision at the doorway, while Daniel waited patiently outside the woodshed. Then, with sudden decisiveness, the mother wolf stepped out into the snow. She paused again, scanning the surroundings, before noticing the trail of meat leading toward the new shelter. Her head lowered to sniff the offering, and after a moment's consideration, she consumed the first piece. The pups followed tentatively, their movements awkward in the deep snow despite Daniel's efforts to pack it down. They stuck close to their mother, occasionally stumbling but quickly regaining their footing. One by one, the wolves followed the scent trail across the yard to the woodshed entrance. At the woodshed doorway, the mother wolf hesitated again. Daniel had positioned himself inside near the far wall, wanting the wolves to associate him with this new space from the beginning. The mother's amber gaze locked onto him, then swept across the prepared shelter area with evident wariness. "It's all yours," Daniel said softly. "More comfortable than the mudroom, and you can come and go as you need to once you're stronger." Whether influenced by his calm tone or driven by her own assessment of the shelter's benefits, the mother wolf finally entered. The pups scampered in behind her, immediately beginning to explore the larger space with growing confidence. Daniel watched their investigation with quiet satisfaction. The mother circled the perimeter of the shelter area several times before, finally settling on the raised platform, her vigilant gaze still fixed on the human observer. "I'll bring Runt to join you tomorrow if he continues improving," Daniel told her, receiving a slow blink in response. "For tonight, I think he's better, off by the stove." As he turned to leave, a soft whine from the mother wolf caused him to pause and look back. She had risen again and taken a step toward him, her head slightly lowered. It wasn't submission. Wild wolves didn't submit to humans, but something more complex. Recognition, perhaps. Acknowledgement. "You're welcome," Daniel said simply. Back in the cabin, he found Atlas sitting beside Runt's nest, the dog's posture attentive but no longer aggressive. Throughout the day, Atlas had gradually transitioned from hostility to reluctant curiosity regarding the wolf pup. Now he looked up at Daniel with an expression that seemed to ask what they were doing with these wild creatures in their carefully ordered home. "Sometimes the rules change, buddy," Daniel told him, scratching the familiar spot behind the dog's ears. "Sometimes survival matters more than boundaries." That night, the temperature plummeted again, the brief reprieve giving way to another Arctic blast. Wind rattled the cabin windows as Daniel stoked the wood stove one last time before bed. Through the window, he could just make out the dim outline of the woodshed. He wondered if the wolves were comfortable, if their new shelter was adequate against the renewed cold. Practicality warned against checking on them in darkness. Wild predators were unpredictable at night. But concern nagged at him until he finally compromised by training his most powerful flashlight on the woodshed. From the cabin window, in its beam, he caught a brief glimpse of movement, the mother wolf making her own patrol of her temporary territory. The sight reassured him enough to finally seek his own rest. The third day dawned clear and brutally cold. Daniel's first action was to check the thermometer. 42 below zero, a deadly temperature that justified his decision to create shelter. For the wolves, no wild creature could survive long in such conditions without adequate shelter and food, especially wolves weakened by starvation. After tending to his own livestock, the chickens and goats in their insulated outbuilding, Daniel carried supplies to the woodshed. The mother wolf watched his approach from the doorway, having apparently established herself as sentry. The pups were not visible, likely huddled in the warmest part of the shelter. "Just breakfast," Daniel announced, setting down a container of fresh water. The previous day's supply had frozen solid overnight, and several pounds of venison. He had begun to ration his meat supply, calculating how long he could sustain both himself and 4 additional carnivores if the extreme weather continued. The mother wolf stepped aside to let him place the provisions, maintaining a careful distance, but no longer retreating entirely. As Daniel arranged the food, he found himself speaking to her, as he might to a fellow human, explaining his plans for the day and commenting on the weather. The one-sided conversation felt natural despite its absurdity. "Runt's doing better this morning," he told her as he finished his task. "Standing longer, eating well. He might be ready to join you by evening." The mother wolf's ears pricked forward at his mention of her missing pup, a reaction so human-like that Daniel almost laughed. Instead, he nodded respectfully before retreating to his cabin. Inside, he found Atlas sitting protectively beside Runt's nest, a development that both surprised and pleased him. The dog had apparently assigned himself guardian duty over the recovering wolf pup. Runt was awake and alert, watching Daniel with bright eyes that had finally fully transitioned from newborn blue to the amber characteristic of wild wolves. "Look at you," Daniel said approvingly as the pup struggled to its feet. Its legs still trembled with weakness, but it managed to remain standing as Daniel checked its condition. The improvement was remarkable. From near death to wobbly but determined vitality in just over 48 hours. Encouraged by this progress, Daniel prepared a more substantial meal for the pup. Finely minced venison mixed with a small amount of ground kibble from Atlas's supplies and plenty of warm broth. Runt attacked the offering with enthusiasm, its appetite another positive sign of recovery. While the pup ate, Daniel's satellite phone chimed with an incoming message. The screen displayed a weather alert. The cold snap was predicted to last at least another 5 days, with temperatures remaining dangerously low throughout. The mountain pass connecting his property to town would remain impassable for the foreseeable future. Daniel wasn't concerned for himself. His preparations were adequate for far longer isolation. But the news confirmed that the wolves would need his assistance for some time yet. He had already begun to wonder about their backstory. Wolf packs didn't typically fragment in winter. Family groups remained together for hunting and survival. Something catastrophic must have happened to separate this mother and her pups from their pack. As if reading his thoughts, Runt finished eating and attempted a more ambitious exploration, wobbling toward the edge of its nest. Daniel watched with amusement as the pup navigated the blanket terrain with determined concentration, each step a victory of will over physical weakness. "Taking after your mother with that stubbornness," he commented. Atlas whined softly, his tail sweeping the floor in hesitant wags as he observed the pup's efforts. By afternoon, Runt had graduated to shaky walks across the cabin floor, always under Atlas's watchful supervision. The dog had assumed an unexpected mentoring role, occasionally nudging the pup back toward its nest when it seemed to be tiring. Daniel marveled at the adaptability of both animals. A domestic dog guiding a wild wolf pup, natural instincts giving way to something more nuanced. The short winter day was already fading when Daniel decided Runt was strong enough to rejoin its family. The pup had demonstrated sufficient recovery to warrant the move, and Daniel sensed it would benefit from its mother's care, despite his own attentiveness. "Time to go home, little one," he told Runt as he carefully lifted the pup into a small carrier padded with blankets. Atlas followed anxiously as Daniel prepared for the short trek to the woodshed, the dog's expression a mixture of concern and resignation. The reunion was nothing short of remarkable. As Daniel approached the woodshed with his precious cargo, the mother wolf appeared in the doorway, her posture instantly alert. Behind her, the two stronger pups crowded forward, drawn by the familiar scent of their sibling. Daniel set the carrier down at a respectful distance and opened its door. For a moment, Runt seemed confused, huddling at the back of the carrier. Then the mother wolf uttered a soft sound, not quite a bark, not quite a howl, but something uniquely wolf that transcended human understanding. At this maternal call, Runt struggled to its feet and took faltering steps toward the carrier's opening. The mother wolf moved forward to meet her returned offspring, her massive head lowering to sniff every inch of the pup. The other two youngsters danced around excitedly, their earlier reserve forgotten in the joy of reunion. As the wolf family reconnected, Daniel stepped back, a lump forming in his throat at the pure animal emotion on display. Atlas pressed against his leg, sharing the moment in companionable silence. The wolves retreated into the woodshed, Runt supported by its mother's careful guidance. Before disappearing into the shadows, the mother wolf paused to look back at Daniel. In her amber eyes, he saw something that defied easy categorization. Not gratitude exactly, for wild things didn't think in such human terms, but a recognition, an acknowledgement of the strange alliance that had formed between species. That night, as Daniel prepared for sleep, the silence of the frozen wilderness was broken by a sound that made him rush to the window. From the direction of the woodshed came the haunting melody of wolf song, the mother's deep, resonant howl, joined by the higher-pitched voices of her pups, including the unmistakably weaker but determined notes of Runt. Atlas lifted his head, ears forward, listening intently to this ancient canine language. Then, to Daniel's astonishment, the dog threw back his head and added his own voice to the chorus, neither fully wolf nor fully separate, but somewhere in between. The unlikely choir continued for several minutes, their combined voices carrying across the snow-blanketed landscape in a declaration of survival against impossible odds. As the howling faded into the night, Daniel settled back into his bed with a sense of wonder. He had expected to save the wolves from freezing. He hadn't expected them to remind him of connections that transcended the boundaries between wild and tame, between solitude and community. In helping them survive, he had somehow recovered something vital within himself, something that had been as cold and dormant as the winter-locked wilderness outside. The extreme cold snap maintained its grip on the mountains for another week. Each morning, Daniel would check the thermometer with diminishing hope, finding the mercury stubbornly hovering between 30 and 40 below zero. The world beyond his property had effectively ceased to exist, communications limited to occasional satellite phone updates, warning of continued dangerous conditions and impassable roads. During this time, the wolf family thrived under Daniel's care. Each day, he delivered fresh water and meat to the woodshed, establishing a routine that became increasingly comfortable for both human and wolves. The mother no longer retreated when he approached, instead waiting expectantly near the doorway, her amber eyes meeting his with growing familiarity. The pups, including Runt, who strengthened daily, had begun to associate Daniel's arrival with good things. They would peek around their mother's legs, no longer hiding at the back of the shelter. By the 5th day, they had grown bold enough to approach within a few feet of him before darting away in a game that seemed half caution, half play. Atlas had adjusted to the strange arrangement with remarkable adaptability. The German Shepherd now accompanied Daniel on his trips to the woodshed, maintaining a respectful distance from the wild wolves but no longer displaying aggression. He and the mother wolf had established a wary understanding, acknowledging each other's presence with dignified tolerance. On the morning of the 8th day, Daniel noticed a significant change in temperature, a relatively balmy 5 degrees above zero, practically spring-like after weeks of Arctic cold. The forecast confirmed what the thermometer suggested. The polar vortex was finally retreating, taking its deadly chill back to the Arctic where it belonged. With the breaking of the cold came a decision point. The wolves had recovered their strength. Even Runt, though still smaller than its siblings, now moved with the coordinated grace characteristic of its species. The time was approaching when Daniel would need to help them transition back to the wild. This realization brought unexpected conflict. Part of him, the practical wilderness survivor, knew that returning the wolves to their natural habitat was the only right course. They were wild predators, not pets, and belonged in the complex ecosystem of the mountain forests. Yet another part, the solitary man who had found surprising connection in caring for these creatures, felt a deep reluctance to sever the unusual bond that had formed. That afternoon, as Daniel approached the woodshed with the daily provisions, he noticed the mother wolf was not in her usual waiting position. Instead, she stood at the far edge of the cleared area, gazing intently toward the tree line. Her posture was alert but not alarmed, her tail held horizontally in what Daniel had come to recognize as neutral attentiveness. Following her gaze, Daniel scanned the forest edge, but saw nothing unusual among the snow-laden pines. Then, just as he was about to dismiss her behavior as routine vigilance, he caught a flash of movement, a gray shadow gliding between distant trees. Then another. Wolves. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. A wild pack was approaching his property, drawn, perhaps by the scent of their separated members. The mother wolf's ears were fully erect now, her body tense with anticipation. The pups sensed the change in their mother, emerging from the woodshed to cluster behind her legs, their small heads swiveling to track whatever had captured her attention. With slow, deliberate movements, Daniel retreated to the cabin, calling Atlas to his side. The dog came reluctantly, his own attention fixed on the forest edge and the invisible presences lurking there. Inside, Daniel grabbed his binoculars and positioned himself at the window facing the woodshed. Through the powerful lenses, he could now make out at least 3 adult wolves moving cautiously along the tree line. They maintained distance, neither approaching openly nor retreating, a reconnaissance patrol rather than an immediate reunion. The mother wolf remained at her position, occasionally lowering her head to reassure the pups, but keeping her primary focus on the forest visitors. As Daniel watched this careful dance of wild diplomacy, a strange mix of emotions washed through him. Relief that the wolf family might be reunited with their pack, mixed with something dangerously close to loss. He had known from the beginning that this arrangement was temporary, yet the prospect of its ending struck harder than anticipated. Night fell without further developments. The visiting wolves had withdrawn deeper into the forest, but not departed entirely. Daniel occasionally caught glimpses of movement or heard distant howls carrying through the clear, cold air. The mother wolf had returned to the woodshed with her pups, but remained unusually alert, frequently emerging to scan the tree line. Daniel slept poorly that night, his dreams filled with running wolves and snow-covered forests. He woke before dawn, immediately going to the window to check on the woodshed. The mother wolf was already outside, standing at attention, her gaze fixed on the forest. Something had changed during the night hours. Her posture now held anticipation rather than wariness. As the first pale light of dawn illuminated the snow-covered landscape, the forest edge came alive with movement. 5 adult wolves emerged from the trees, moving with fluid grace across the open expanse toward the woodshed. Daniel held his breath, watching this moment of wild reunion unfold. The mother wolf stepped forward to meet them, her tail now raised slightly, a signal Daniel recognized as cautious greeting. The pups remained at the woodshed entrance, their small bodies tense with uncertainty. The approaching wolves slowed as they neared, forming a loose semicircle several yards from the mother. What followed was a complex interaction that Daniel could observe, but never fully understand. Subtle shifts in posture, minute adjustments of ears and tails, occasional soft vocalizations, the intricate language of wolves communicating across the divide created by separation. He found himself wishing for Dr. Doolittle's mythical ability to speak with animals, to understand the story being told between these wild creatures. The standoff lasted nearly 10 minutes before the apparent leader of the wild group, a massive male with silver-tipped fur, stepped forward. The mother wolf lowered her head slightly, and the two touched noses in a brief formal greeting. This contact seemed to break the tension, and suddenly the scene transformed from wary evaluation to joyful reunion. The other pack members surged forward, surrounding the mother wolf in a flurry of sniffing, tail wagging, and body rubbing that spoke of familial recognition. The pups, including Runt, initially hung back before curiosity overcame caution. They approached hesitantly, then with growing excitement as they were welcomed into the group with gentle nudges and playful nips. Daniel watched transfixed as the scattered family re-knit itself before his eyes. Though he had only the most basic understanding of wolf society, he could guess at the relationships. Perhaps the silver-tipped male was the pups' father, the others aunts or uncles or older siblings from previous litters. Whatever their specific connections, the intensity of their reunion left no doubt about the bonds that united them. After the initial greetings, the entire group, now 9 wolves strong, moved toward the forest in a loose formation. The mother wolf paused at the edge of the trees, looking back toward Daniel's cabin as if sensing his observation. For a long moment she stood motionless, her amber eyes seeming to search for something. Then, with deliberate purpose, she left the pack and trotted back toward the woodshed. Daniel's heart leaped. Was she returning to stay, coming to say goodbye? He watched as she disappeared into the shelter, emerging moments later with something in her mouth. Even from a distance, he recognized one of the blankets he had provided, a thick wool army surplus item that had been part of the bedding. The mother wolf carried this token to the middle of the yard and carefully placed it in the snow. She looked toward the cabin once more, then rejoined her waiting pack. Together, they melted into the forest, visible one moment and gone the next, leaving only a set of tracks across the pristine snow as evidence of their passage. Daniel waited until they had been gone for several minutes before venturing out to retrieve the blanket. Atlas followed close at his heels, sniffing excitedly at the fresh wolf scent that permeated the air. The blanket lay precisely where the Mother Wolf had placed it, not discarded, but deliberately positioned, like an object on an altar. As he picked it up, Daniel noticed something odd. The blanket had been folded, not with human precision, but folded nonetheless, the corners roughly, aligned in a way that could not have occurred naturally. A wolf cannot understand the human concept of folding laundry, yet this wild creature had apparently mimicked the action she had observed during her stay, creating a gesture that bridged the gap between their worlds. She said, "Thank you, Daniel," murmured to Atlas, who whined softly in response. The temperature continued to rise over the next few days, climbing into the 20s above zero, practically tropical by Montana winter standards. The mountain pass to town was finally cleared, reconnecting Daniel's remote property to the wider world. He made the journey to White River for supplies, finding the small town buzzing with stories of the historic cold snap and its effects on local wildlife. At the general store, while loading bags of dog food into his truck, Daniel overheard a conversation between two rangers from the nearby national forest. "Strangest thing," one was saying. "That wolf pack that lost half its members in the logging camp incident last month. They're back together somehow." Daniel paused, his hand freezing on a 50-pound bag. "Thought that Mother and her pups were goners for sure," the second ranger replied. "No way they could have survived that cold spell on their own after being separated from the pack. Well, aerial survey spotted them yesterday, all together again, 9 strong, moving through the North Ridge area. How they found each other and survived is anyone's guess." Daniel finished loading his supplies without comment, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Some stories weren't meant for sharing. Some connections existed beyond human explanation. That evening, as he unpacked his provisions in the now quiet cabin, Daniel felt the emptiness of the space more acutely than he had in years. Atlas seemed to share his melancholy, occasionally, wandering to the door and looking out toward the now vacant woodshed with a questioning whine. "They're where they belong, buddy," Daniel told him, scratching the familiar spot behind the dog's ears. "And so are we." He believed those words, even as he acknowledged the hollow space their departure had left. For a brief time, his isolated existence had expanded to include others, wild others who needed him, who connected him to something primal and profound. Their absence was the correct end to the story, yet it left an ache nonetheless. As darkness fell, Daniel settled into his usual evening routine, stoking the fire, reading by lamplight, sharing occasional scraps with Atlas. The normalcy felt both comforting and somehow lacking after the unusual intensity of the past weeks. Just as he was preparing for bed, a sound drifted through the night, faint at first, then growing stronger. Wolves howling, their voices blending in that ancient haunting harmony that spoke of wildness and freedom. Not from the distant forests, but much closer, perhaps from the ridge just beyond his property. Daniel stepped onto his porch, Atlas at his side, both listening intently to the wolf chorus. He recognized her voice among them, the mother wolf's distinctive timbre standing out to his now educated ear. The message was clear. They were nearby, they were together, they were thriving. Without conscious thought, Daniel tilted his head back and released his own voice, not in words, but in a primal sound that rose from some deep forgotten place within him. Atlas joined immediately, his canine howl bridging the gap between human and wolf song. For a brief, transcendent moment, all boundaries dissolved, between wild and tame, between solitude and connection, between species separated by millennia of divergent evolution, yet still bound by something older than time. Their combined voices carried across the moonlit snow, a testament to unlikely bonds formed in the face of impossible odds. The wolves eventually fell silent, their message delivered, their acknowledgement complete. Daniel and Atlas remained on, The porch a while longer, the cold air sharp in their lungs, the stars brilliant overhead. Something had changed in Daniel during these weeks. Some frozen part of himself had thawed alongside the warming weather. The solitude he had built around himself like armor now felt less like protection and more like limitation. Tomorrow, he decided, he would call his sister in Bozeman. It had been almost 2 years since they'd spoken. Perhaps it was time to reconnect with his own pack. As if sensing this shift, Atlas pressed against his leg in silent companionship. Daniel rested his hand on the dog's head, feeling profound gratitude for this faithful presence that had remained constant while accommodating such extraordinary change. "Come on, buddy," he said finally. "Let's get some sleep." They returned inside, closing the door on the winter night, but carrying with them the memory of wild voices calling across the divide, and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest survival skill is knowing when to break the rules. Spring came to the Montana mountains like a slow awakening, patches of bare ground emerging from melting snow as temperatures gradually climbed. Daniel had spent the remainder of winter in a quieter routine, the extraordinary episode with the wolf family fading into memory, though never entirely disappearing. True to his resolution, he had reconnected with his sister in Bozeman, even making the 3-hour drive to visit her and her family for a weekend, his first voluntary venture into the crowded world of humans in nearly 2 years. April brought the first real thaws, turning the access road to his property into a muddy challenge even for his 4-wheel drive truck. The forest surrounding his cabin erupted with new life, birds returning from southern migrations, deer venturing into meadows to browse on fresh growth, and wildflowers pushing through the soil in determined bursts of color. Daniel spent more time outdoors as the weather improved, resuming his photography with renewed interest. The camera that had gathered dust on his shelf through much of winter now accompanied him on daily walks through his property and the surrounding wilderness. Atlas trotted faithfully at his side, the dog's enthusiasm for these expanded excursions evident in his pricked ears and waving tail. They never ventured into the North Ridge area where the wolf pack had established their territory. This wasn't fear, but respect, an acknowledgement that some boundaries should remain intact despite the unusual connection that had briefly bridged them. Occasionally at night, Daniel would hear distant howling carrying across the valleys, and Atlas would lift his head in recognition, but they made no attempt to seek closer contact. One warm May afternoon, Daniel was photographing a particularly vibrant patch of glacier lilies near the eastern edge of his property when Atlas suddenly stiffened beside him. The dog's posture shifted from relaxed companionship to alert vigilance, his ears forward, nose testing the air. "What is it, boy?" Daniel asked, automatically scanning their surroundings for potential threats. Mountain lions occasionally passed through these parts, and black bears were emerging from hibernation hungry and potentially aggressive. Atlas whined softly, but didn't bark. His reaction to perceived danger would have been more pronounced. Instead, he stared intently toward a dense stand of pines about 50 yards distant, his tail making small, uncertain movements. Daniel raised his camera, using the telephoto lens as a makeshift spotting scope to examine the area that had captured his dog's attention. At first, he saw nothing unusual among the trees. Then a shadow detached itself from deeper shadows, resolving into a familiar form, a wolf, moving with deliberate caution along the forest edge. His breath caught as recognition dawned. The distinctive markings, the confident posture, the alert amber eyes. It was her, the mother wolf, now looking sleek and powerful in her spring coat, a far cry from the desperate creature he had sheltered through the coldest days of winter. She paused at the tree line, clearly aware of Daniel and Atlas's presence in the meadow. For a long moment, they regarded each other across the distance, human, domestic dog, and wild wolf locked in a silent exchange that acknowledged their shared history. Daniel slowly lowered his camera, making no sudden movements that might be interpreted as threat or pursuit. He expected her to melt back into the forest at any moment. Instead, the wolf did something that made him question his own eyes. She deliberately lowered her head and body in what appeared to be a bow, held the position for several seconds, then straightened and turned toward the trees. Before disappearing, she looked back once more, and Daniel would later swear she gave a short, sharp bark, not of warning but of greeting. Then she was gone, vanished into the forest as completely as if she had never been there at all. Atlas whined again, taking a few steps toward the trees before stopping to look back at Daniel. With clear confusion, the dog seemed torn between respecting the boundaries his master had established and responding to something that called to his more ancient instincts. "It's okay," Daniel assured him. "She was just checking on us." That brief encounter might have been the end of the story, a momentary reconnection, a final acknowledgement before their paths diverged completely. But fate, or perhaps something more deliberate, had other plans. Summer arrived in the mountains with a vengeance that year. June brought record heat and drought conditions that transformed the lush spring landscape into a tinderbox of dry vegetation and parched earth. By early July, wildfires had ignited in several locations across the state, their smoke turning sunsets blood red and casting a perpetual haze across the valleys. Daniel watched the situation with growing concern. His property had natural fire breaks, creek on one side, rocky escarpments on another, but no wilderness dwelling was truly safe if a major fire decided to claim it. He packed emergency supplies in his truck and kept the radio tuned to Forest Service frequencies, prepared to evacuate at the first sign of immediate danger. The threat materialized sooner than expected. On a sweltering afternoon in mid-July, Daniel spotted the first ominous plume rising from the southwest, much too close for comfort. Within hours, the Forest Service alert confirmed his fears. A lightning strike had ignited a fast-moving blaze that was already consuming hundreds of acres and advancing toward his sector of the mountains. "Time to go, Atlas," he said grimly, loading the last of his emergency supplies and irreplaceable belongings into the truck. The dog sensed the urgency in his voice, obediently jumping into the passenger seat without his usual excitement about truck rides. Daniel took one last look at the cabin he had built with his own hands before climbing behind the wheel. If the fire claimed it, he would rebuild, but the loss would cut deep nonetheless. He started the engine and began navigating the rugged access road that would take them to the main highway in safety. They had covered perhaps 2 miles when disaster struck. A massive dead pine, weakened by insect damage and drought, suddenly crashed across the road directly in their path. Daniel slammed on the brakes, the truck sliding in loose gravel before coming to a halt mere feet from the blockage. The fallen tree was enormous, at least 3 feet in diameter and stretching the entire width of the narrow mountain road. Daniel surveyed the situation with sinking heart. The steep terrain on either side made off-road navigation impossible, and the tree was far too large to move without heavy equipment. "We'll have to go back and try the old logging trail," he told Atlas, preparing to execute a careful 3-point turn on the narrow road. The logging trail was barely more than a rough track that wound through the most difficult terrain on his property, eventually connecting to a different access road miles to the north. It was a desperate option, but their only alternative to being trapped by the approaching fire. As Daniel maneuvered the truck, Atlas suddenly erupted in a frenzy of barking, his attention fixed on the road ahead beyond the fallen tree. Daniel looked up to see what had triggered this reaction and froze, with his hands on the wheel. On the far side of the blockage stood 3 wolves. Not just any wolves. The mother and 2 of her now adolescent offspring, instantly recognizable despite their growth over the intervening months. They stood in perfect stillness, regarding the trapped truck with an intensity that raised the hair on Daniel's arms. For a surreal moment, no one moved, not the human, not the domestic dog, not the wild wolves. Then, as if responding to some unspoken command, the wolves turned and began trotting up the road in the direction Daniel had been headed. After about 50 yards, the mother wolf stopped and looked back, clearly waiting. "They want us to follow," Daniel murmured in disbelief. He completed the turn and drove back to the cabin, then veered onto a faint trail that paralleled the main access road at a higher elevation. It was rough going, the truck bouncing over rocks and dipping into gullies that tested its substantial clearance. Atlas braced himself against the door, his attention divided between the difficult terrain and the occasional glimpses of the wolves moving through the forest alongside their route. The parallel paths continued for nearly a mile before the wolf trio angled sharply uphill, disappearing over a rocky ridge. Daniel hesitated only briefly before following, guiding the truck up a barely perceptible game trail that he would never have attempted under normal circumstances. At the ridgetop, he stopped in amazement. Before him stretched an overgrown but navigable track, an old fire road from the days when this entire area had been actively managed by the Forest Service, long since abandoned and erased from current maps. The wolves stood waiting at its entrance, the mother's posture radiating expectation. "I'll be damned," Daniel whispered. The old fire road wound through a section of forest Daniel had never fully explored, eventually connecting to a maintained gravel road that would lead them safely away from the advancing wildfire. Without the wolves' guidance, he would never have found this escape route in time. At the junction with the gravel road, the wolves stopped. The mother approached the truck as Daniel rolled to a halt, coming close enough that he could have reached out and touched her had the window been open. Her amber eyes met his with that same impossible communication he had sensed during their winter encounter, a connection that transcended the natural boundaries between their kinds. Then, with a soft woof that fogged the glass between them, she turned away. The three wolves loped back toward the forest they had helped Daniel escape, returning to their own territory, perhaps to outrun the same fire that had threatened him. 2 days later, when the fire had been partially contained and residents were allowed to return to assess damage, Daniel drove back along the main access road, now cleared of the fallen tree by forestry crews. He found his cabin untouched, the fire having changed direction before reaching his property. That evening, as smoke still tinged the horizon orange, Daniel sat on his porch with Atlas at his feet. From the north ridge came the familiar sound of wolf song, a celebration of survival perhaps, or simply the ancient call that maintained pack connections across the vast wilderness. Atlas lifted his head, ears forward in recognition. Daniel smiled and reached down to scratch his faithful companion behind the ears. "Some debts," he said quietly, "can only be repaid in kind." In the weeks that followed, Daniel found himself changing routines he had maintained for years. He accepted an invitation to speak at the local high school about wilderness photography. He volunteered with the Forest Service's wildlife monitoring program. He drove to Bozeman every other Sunday for dinner with his sister's family. Each small step took him further from the isolated existence he had built after returning from war. Each connection reminded him of lessons learned from unlikely teachers, that survival sometimes depends not on self-reliance alone, but on the bridges built between even the most different of beings. As summer gave way to fall, Daniel occasionally glimpsed wolves moving along distant ridgelines. Whether they were his wolves or others, he couldn't be certain. It didn't matter. The boundary between their worlds remained, necessary, natural, and right. But it had been crossed once in shared need, and that crossing had left its mark. On both sides, some nights, when the mountain air carried sounds for great distances, Daniel would step onto his porch and listen for the wolf chorus from the north ridge. On rare occasions, when he heard their voices lifting in that ancient harmony, he would add his own call to their song, a human voice joining wild ones across the divide, acknowledging a debt that transcended understanding. And sometimes, carried back on the night wind, came an answering howl, distinct and deliberate, as if directed specifically to the human who had once sheltered a desperate mother and her cubs from killing cold, and who had in turn been shown a path to safety when he needed it most. 2 years passed, seasons turning in their ancient rhythm across the Montana wilderness. Daniel's life had found a new balance, still centered around his remote cabin, but no longer defined by isolation. His photography had experienced a renaissance, his work appearing in national wildlife magazines for the first time since before his military service. The images he captured now possessed a depth and intimacy that his earlier work had lacked, as if his brief connection with the wolf family had granted him fresh insight into the secret world of wild creatures. Atlas had aged gracefully into his senior years, his muzzle frosting with grey, but his spirit undimmed. The German Shepherd moved more slowly on their daily hikes, but remained Daniel's constant companion, his alertness to their surroundings undiminished by time. Together, they maintained their cautious respect for the North Ridge territory where the wolf pack roamed, occasionally hearing their howls, but never seeking direct contact. Daniel had expanded his connections to the human world as well. His volunteer work with the Forest Service had led to a part-time position as a wildlife monitoring consultant. Twice monthly, he ventured into the most remote sections of the national forest, placing and retrieving camera traps that helped track the movements and health of various species. The data he gathered informed conservation efforts while allowing him to maintain the solitude he still craved. On a crisp October morning, with leaves blazing in autumn splendor, Daniel loaded his gear into his truck for a 3-day expedition into the backcountry. This particular trip would take him farther north than usual, near the Canadian border, where recent reports indicated a possible new wolf pack establishing territory. The Forest Service was eager to document any population expansion, particularly given the controversial status of wolf reintroduction programs in the region. "Sorry, old friend," Daniel told Atlas, who watched the preparations with evident disappointment. "Not this time. The terrain would be too demanding for the aging dog, requiring miles of hiking through rugged country. You're on guard duty here." Atlas sighed dramatically, but accepted the decision, settling onto the porch with the dignified resignation of a soldier following unwelcome but necessary orders. Daniel chuckled at the display, giving the dog a final scratch behind the ears before climbing into his truck. The drive north took most of the day, winding through increasingly remote landscapes where human habitation appeared only as occasional. Cabins set far back from barely maintained roads. By late afternoon, Daniel reached the trailhead where he would begin his hike into the study area. He double-checked his backpack, camera equipment, GPS, emergency satellite phone, food, and camping gear before securing his truck and setting off on foot. 2 hours of steady hiking brought him to the first camera placement location just as twilight began to settle over the forest. Working efficiently in the fading light, Daniel mounted the motion-activated camera on a tree overlooking a game trail, carefully angling it to capture any wildlife passing through the natural corridor. He would collect it and its data on his return journey 3 days later. With darkness approaching, he hiked another half-mile to a small clearing suitable for camping. The site offered good visibility, access to a nearby stream for water, and enough space to set up his one-man tent without disturbing the surrounding vegetation. Years in the wilderness had taught him to establish camp with minimal impact, leaving no trace of his presence when he departed. The night passed peacefully, the clear autumn sky presenting a spectacular display of stars undiminished by artificial light. Daniel woke at first light, prepared a simple breakfast over his small camp stove, then packed up to continue deeper into the backcountry. Today's journey would take him to the heart of the reported new wolf territory. By midday, he had placed 3 more cameras at strategic locations, each carefully documented in his GPS. The Forest Service technicians would retrieve the devices in approximately 1 month, but Daniel preferred to handle the initial placement himself, his intimate knowledge of wildlife behavior allowing him to select optimal positions for capturing animal movements. As he hiked toward his final camera location for the day, Daniel became aware of subtle changes in the forest atmosphere. Birds that had been calling sporadically throughout the morning fell silent. The ambient rustle of small creatures in the underbrush ceased. These were familiar signals to an experienced outdoorsman, indications that something had disturbed the natural order. Daniel paused, his senses heightened. He wasn't carrying a firearm, having long ago decided that his camera was the only weapon he wished to wield in the wilderness. Instead, he relied on awareness and respect when encountering predators. Standing motionless, he scanned his surroundings, focusing particularly on the denser sections of forest where visibility was limited. The crack of a breaking branch to his left caused him to turn slowly in that direction. Through a gap in the undergrowth, he glimpsed movement, a flash of tawny fur that instantly registered as mountain lion. Unlike wolves or bears, which typically avoided humans unless provoked, mountain lions were stealthy ambush predators known to occasionally stalk humans, particularly lone hikers. Daniel maintained visual contact with the area where he'd spotted movement while slowly shrugging off his backpack. Inside was a canister of bear spray, effective against all large predators, and his preferred defensive tool. As he carefully unzipped the pack, another sound caught his attention, a distinctive scraping from above and behind him. He turned in time to see a massive branch plummeting toward him from the canopy above. Instinct took over, his body twisting to avoid the direct impact, but the heavy limbs still caught his shoulder, sending him sprawling to the forest floor. Pain lanced through his left side as he tried to roll away from the fallen branch, his arm responding sluggishly to commands from his brain. The mountain lion burst from cover almost immediately, taking advantage of its prey's sudden vulnerability. Daniel caught a blur of muscle and fur as he desperately reached for the bear spray with his good arm. The distance was too close, the predator too fast. He braced for the impact of claws and fangs. A gray shadow intercepted the charging mountain lion in mid-leap, colliding with the tawny predator in an explosion of snarls and snapping teeth. Daniel scrambled backward, disbelieving what his eyes reported. A wolf had intervened, placing itself between him and certain injury or death, not just any wolf. Even in the chaos of the moment, he recognized her, larger now and bearing new scars across her muzzle, but unmistakably the same mother wolf he had sheltered years earlier. She fought with calculated ferocity, targeting the mountain lion's vulnerable areas while evading its superior weight and strength. The big cat, suddenly faced with an unexpected defender, reassessed the situation. What had appeared to be an injured human alone in the forest was now protected by a full-grown wolf fighting with unusual determination. After a brief but intense skirmish that left both animals bleeding from minor wounds, the mountain lion retreated, disappearing into the underbrush as quickly as it had emerged. Daniel remained frozen, his injured shoulder throbbing in time with his racing heart. The wolf stood with her back to him, facing the direction where the mountain lion had vanished, her posture alert for any sign of returning threat. Only when she seemed satisfied that the danger had passed did she turn to regard Daniel with those familiar amber eyes. "You remembered," Daniel whispered, the enormity of what had just occurred washing over him in waves. After all this time. The wolf approached cautiously, her nose testing the air around him, particularly near his injured shoulder. Blood had begun to seep through his jacket sleeve where the impact had torn his skin. With careful movements, Daniel shifted to a sitting position, wincing as pain shot through his upper body. "Think it's dislocated," he told the wolf, who watched him with an intensity that seemed almost concerned. "Maybe cracked collarbone too." The situation was serious. Even with his wilderness medical training, treating a dislocated shoulder alone in the backcountry would be extremely difficult. The satellite phone in his pack could summon help, but evacuation from this remote location would take hours at minimum. As if sensing his predicament, the wolf moved closer, allowing Daniel to brace himself against her solid form as he struggled to his feet. Once upright, he managed to retrieve the satellite phone one-handed and send an emergency signal with his GPS coordinates. The Forest Service would dispatch rescue personnel, but darkness would fall before they could reach him. "Need to get to more open ground," Daniel said to his unlikely companion. "Make it easier for them to find us." The wolf seemed to understand, or at least tolerate, his slow progress as he gathered his most essential gear into a smaller pack that he could manage despite his injury. His original destination, a large rocky outcropping that offered views across the valley, would serve as an ideal location for rescue teams to spot him. What followed was one of the strangest journeys of Daniel's life. The wolf walked beside him, occasionally pressing against his right side when his balance faltered on the uneven terrain. When his path was blocked by fallen trees or dense underbrush, she would find an easier route, then wait for him to follow. Their progress was painfully slow, the distance that would normally take less than an hour stretching into a 3-hour ordeal as pain and declining mobility hampered Daniel's movements. As they finally emerged onto the rocky outcropping, the sun was already disappearing behind the western peaks. Temperature would drop rapidly with nightfall, a potentially dangerous situation given Daniel's injured state. Shock and hypothermia were real concerns in the wilderness, even for someone with his experience. He managed to unfold his emergency, a thermal blanket one-handed, and sat with his back against a boulder that offered some protection from the rising wind. The wolf settled beside him, her warm body radiating heat along his right side. The unlikely tableau, injured human and wild wolf sharing space and warmth, might have seemed surreal if Daniel hadn't experienced something similar once before. "Never expected to see you again," he told her as darkness enveloped the mountain. "Certainly not like this." The wolf's eyes gleamed in the fading light, reflecting the same impossible understanding he had glimpsed during that long-ago winter storm. She shifted position slightly, pressing more firmly against him as the temperature continued to drop. The gesture was so reminiscent of how Atlas would offer comfort and warmth that Daniel felt a sudden, sharp longing for his faithful dog waiting. Back at the cabin, night fell completely, bringing the unique silence of wilderness darkness, broken only by the occasional call of a distant owl. Daniel drifted in and out of awareness, the pain in his shoulder flaring whenever he moved, but gradually numbed by the cold. The wolf remained vigilant beside him, her ears constantly moving to track sounds beyond human perception. He was roused from a pain-induced doze by the wolf's sudden alertness, her body tensed, ears forward, gaze fixed on the darkness beyond their rocky shelter. Daniel strained to hear whatever had captured her attention, at first perceiving nothing. Then, faintly, but growing stronger, the distinctive whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of helicopter rotors approaching. On the morning after the storm's peak, Daniel woke to Atlas's insistent whining at the bedroom door, an unusual behavior for the typically patient dog. Concerned, he rose quickly, following the elderly shepherd as he hobbled urgently toward the cabin's main entrance. At the door, Atlas pawed at the frame and looked back at his human expectantly. "What is it, boy?" Daniel asked, peering through the frost-edged window beside the door. The world outside had transformed into a white sculpture garden, snowdrifts, reaching halfway up the porch rails and still accumulating as flakes continued to fall in the pre-dawn dimness. At first, he saw nothing unusual in the snowscape. Then as his eyes adjusted to the limited light, he noticed tracks leading up to his porch. Wolf tracks, unmistakably fresh and partially filled with newly fallen snow. His heart quickened as he scanned the surroundings more carefully. There, at the edge of the tree line, barely visible through the curtain of falling snow, a gray shape standing motionless, watching the cabin. Not just any wolf, but her. The connection between them now so familiar that Daniel recognized her silhouette instantly, even at this distance. Without hesitation, he pulled on his cold weather gear and boots. Atlas whined again, pushing his nose against Daniel's leg with unmistakable urgency. "Is she in trouble?" Daniel asked, the memory of that desperate winter night surfacing in his mind. The dog couldn't answer, of course, but his continued agitation suggested something beyond a routine wildlife sighting. Daniel grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight and stepped onto the porch, its beam cutting through the pre-dawn darkness and swirling snow. The wolf at the tree line didn't flee from the light, another sign that something unusual was happening. Instead, she took several steps forward, then stopped, looking back toward the forest before returning her gaze to Daniel. The invitation was unmistakable, the same behavior she had displayed during the wildfire when she had guided him to safety. She wanted him to follow. Daniel hesitated briefly, years of wilderness experience warning against following a wild predator into the forest during a snowstorm. Yet the debt between them, the connection forged through multiple life-saving encounters, outweighed conventional caution. If she needed his help, he would provide it. "Stay here," he told Atlas firmly, knowing the elderly dog couldn't manage a trek through deep snow. Atlas protested with a sorrowful whine, but remained on the porch as Daniel descended the steps and began trudging toward the waiting wolf. When he reached the tree line, she turned and moved into the forest at a measured pace, frequently looking back to ensure he followed. The snow beneath the conifer canopy was slightly less deep, allowing for easier progress, though Daniel still found himself breathing heavily with exertion. The wolf led him along what appeared to be a game trail, the path winding between massive pines whose branches sagged beneath their white burden. After nearly 20 minutes of difficult hiking, she stopped at the edge of a small clearing. In its center stood the remains of a hunter's blind, a simple wooden structure elevated on stilts, now partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow. From within the damaged shelter came sounds that instantly raised the hair on Daniel's neck, pained whimpering interspersed with frightened growls. The wolf looked from Daniel to the shelter and back again, her message clear. Something or someone important to her was trapped inside the collapsing structure. Daniel approached cautiously, circling to view the blind from different angles. One wall had completely given way, and the platform had partially detached from its supporting posts, creating a dangerous tilt. Through the damaged section, he could make out movement inside, a glimpse of fur, the flash of frightened eyes. The situation became clear as he drew closer. Two adolescent wolves, likely part of last year's litter, now approaching adult size but still clearly subordinate pack members, had sought shelter from the storm in the blind. When the structure began to collapse, one had escaped, but the other was now pinned beneath fallen timbers, its hindquarters trapped while its front legs scrabbled desperately at the wooden flooring. The mother wolf, for Daniel was now certain this was indeed the same mother he had first rescued years ago, circled anxiously, clearly distressed by her offspring's predicament, but unable to provide help. Daniel assessed the situation with growing concern. The blind's collapse was still in progress, the remaining structural supports groaning under shifting weight. Any further failure could crush the trapped wolf completely. Yet extracting a frightened, injured wild predator presented extraordinary dangers of its own. "I need to stabilize it first," he said aloud, his breath clouding in the frigid air. The mother wolf watched him intently, as if understanding his words. Returning to the forest edge, Daniel selected a fallen branch of appropriate size to serve as a temporary support. The wood was partially frozen to the ground, requiring all his strength to break it free. He dragged it to the blind and carefully positioned it under the sagging platform, creating a brace that would prevent further collapse. With the immediate danger addressed, he turned to the more delicate task of freeing the trapped wolf. The young animal panicked at his approach, baring its teeth and renewing its frantic efforts to escape, which only risked further injury and damage to the precarious structure. The mother wolf surprised him by moving to the opening and emitting a low, rumbling sound. Not quite a growl, but a clear communication to her offspring. The trapped wolf immediately ceased its struggles, though its eyes remained wide with fear as Daniel drew closer. "Easy now," he murmured, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm here to help." The fallen timbers formed a dangerous puzzle. Moving one piece incorrectly could cause the others to shift, potentially causing greater injury. Daniel examined the configuration carefully, identifying the key beam that needed to be lifted to release the young wolf's trapped legs. The timber was heavy, requiring significant strength to move. Under normal circumstances, such a lift would be challenging but manageable. In the confined, unstable space of the collapsing blind, with freezing temperatures numbing his fingers and a frightened predator inches away, it became a formidable task. Daniel positioned himself for maximum leverage, grasped the beam with both hands, and braced his feet against the platform's edge. With a grunt of effort, he began to lift, muscles straining against the unyielding weight. The beam shifted slightly, rising perhaps 2 inches, not enough for the wolf to pull free. Daniel's arms trembled with exertion as he struggled to maintain even this minimal progress. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold, immediately chilling against his skin. Just as his strength began to falter, he felt movement beside him. The mother wolf had entered the unstable structure and now pressed, her body against the beam, adding her weight and strength to his effort. The unexpected assistance allowed Daniel to reposition his grip and heave upward with renewed determination. This time, the beam lifted nearly 6 inches, enough space for the trapped wolf to wriggle backward, pulling its hindquarters free with a final desperate lunge. The young animal scrambled out of the blind, leaving smears of blood on the wooden floor where jagged splinters had torn its flesh. Daniel carefully lowered the beam, then backed out of the structure before its compromised supports could give way entirely. Outside, he found the mother wolf examining her injured offspring, nose carefully inspecting the wounds on its hindquarters. The injuries appeared painful, but not life-threatening, lacerations rather than broken bones. The freed wolf regarded Daniel with a mixture of fear and confusion, clearly struggling to reconcile its natural wariness of humans with the evidence of his assistance. When he took a step toward them, the young wolf shrank back, instinct overriding any potential gratitude. The mother, however, held her ground, meeting Daniel's gaze with the same impossible understanding he had witnessed during their previous encounters. For a moment, they stood in perfect stillness, snow swirling around them in the strengthening dawn light, wild and human, connected by a thread of mutual aid that defied conventional boundaries. Then, with a soft woof that fogged the air between them, she turned away, nudging her injured offspring into motion. The young wolf limped noticeably but could travel, following its mother's lead as they moved deeper into the forest. At the edge of the clearing, the mother paused one final time, looking back at Daniel with what he could only interpret as acknowledgement. "You're welcome," he called, the words immediately swallowed by the vast silence of the snow-covered wilderness. The return journey to his cabin seemed both longer and easier than the outward trek. a fresh surge of adrenaline carrying Daniel through the deepening snow. By the time he reached his porch, the early morning light had strengthened enough to illuminate the full extent of the storm's impact, at least 18 inches of new accumulation, with drifts considerably deeper in places. Atlas greeted him with anxious whines and unsteady tail wags, clearly relieved at his return. Daniel knelt to reassure the elderly dog, brushing snow from his beard as he recounted their latest extraordinary intersection with the wolf family. "They find us when they need us," he told Atlas, who listened with solemn attention. "And somehow they're there when we need them too." That evening, as darkness settled over the mountains and the storm finally abated, Daniel stood on his porch with Atlas leaning heavily against his leg. The star-filled sky emerged as clouds dissipated, casting pale blue light across the unmarked snow extending from his cabin to the forest edge. The temperature had plummeted with nightfall, the air crystalline and still in the storm's aftermath. From the direction of the North Ridge came the familiar sound of wolf song, the pack's voices, blending in haunting harmony that carried for miles in the clear air. Daniel closed his eyes, allowing the primal music to wash over him. Within the chorus, he could distinguish individual voices, the deeper tones of adult males, the slightly higher pitch of females, and the less disciplined contributions of younger wolves. Among them, unmistakable to his now educated ear, was her voice, the mother wolf who had once again sought his assistance in a moment of desperation. The sound carried no hints of the morning's crisis, only the serene confirmation that the pack endured, together and unbroken. As the howling continued, Atlas lifted his graying muzzle and offered his own contribution, a wavering howl that held unmistakable canine joy despite its weakened delivery. Daniel smiled at the old dog's participation in this ancient conversation, a bridge between the domestic and the wild. When the wolves finally fell silent, Daniel lingered on the porch, his thoughts drifting to the extraordinary circle of reciprocity that had formed between himself and the wolf family. What had begun as a simple act of compassion during a winter storm had evolved into something profound, an ongoing exchange of life-preserving interventions that defied explanation through conventional scientific frameworks. He had no name for this connection, no adequate language to describe how a human and a wild wolf had transcended the natural boundaries between their kinds to forge something unprecedented. Perhaps it was a reminder that beneath the veneer of civilization, humans remained part of the natural world, capable of communicating across species lines in ways that had been largely forgotten in the modern age. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition by two intelligent predator species that cooperation sometimes offered survival advantages that isolation could not match. Whatever the explanation, Daniel knew with absolute certainty that their paths would cross again, not by random chance, but by deliberate seeking when need arose. The knowledge brought not fear, but a profound sense of belonging to something larger than himself, a web of relationships extending beyond human society into the wider community of living beings that shared these mountains. As he finally turned to go inside, Atlas at his side, Daniel cast one last glance toward the North Ridge where the wolf pack made their home. "Until next time," he said softly, his words carried away on the night breeze. Perhaps to be lost in the vastness of the wilderness, perhaps to reach sensitive ears that might recognize, if not their meaning, then the sentiment behind them. The door closed behind them, sealing out the winter cold, but not the awareness that had fundamentally altered Daniel's understanding of his place in the wild world. No longer an observer or temporary guest, but a participant in an ongoing dialogue between species, rich with meaning that transcended words. Spring came to the mountains with its familiar rhythm of melting snow and awakening life. Daniel found himself busier than in previous years, his photography work gaining renewed recognition through a series of exhibitions in Bozeman and Missoula. The images capturing Montana's wildlife had struck a chord with audiences, particularly his wolf photographs, which revealed an intimacy rarely achieved with such elusive predators. What the exhibition attendees couldn't know, what Daniel never explained in his artist statements or interviews, was the extraordinary relationship that had allowed such proximity. Some secrets belonged to the wilderness alone. Atlas had weathered the winter, though each passing month revealed his increasing frailty. The once powerful shepherd now moved with painful slowness, his back legs occasionally failing him entirely. Daniel had constructed wooden ramps over the porch steps and adapted their routines to accommodate the aging dog's limitations. They still took daily walks, but these had become slow circuits of the immediate yard rather than the longer forest excursions they had once enjoyed. On a warm May afternoon, Daniel sat on his porch editing photographs while Atlas dozed in a patch of sunlight. The peaceful scene was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel, a rare occurrence at his remote property. A Forest Service truck appeared around the final bend in his access road, rolling to a stop near his cabin. Two rangers emerged from the vehicle, both familiar to Daniel through his wildlife monitoring work. Their expression suggested this wasn't a routine visit. Daniel, the senior ranger, Mike Holloway, called as he approached. "Got a minute to talk?" "Sure," Daniel replied, setting aside his laptop. "Coffee?" The rangers accepted his offer, following him inside while Atlas remained sleeping in the sun. Once seated at his kitchen table with steaming mugs before them, the reason for their visit emerged. "We've got a situation developing with one of the wolf packs," Mike explained, spreading a topographical map across the table. "The North Ridge Pack specifically, the ones you've been photographing." Daniel maintained a neutral expression, though his pulse quickened at the mention of her pack. "What kind of situation?" The younger ranger, Jesse Thompson, leaned forward. "A new hunting outfit has leased land bordering the national forest on the northeast section." Her finger traced a boundary on the map. "They're applying for predator control permits, claiming wolf predation on livestock is hurting their business." "Are they running cattle up there?" Daniel asked, knowing the terrain was hardly ideal for grazing. "Some, but mostly they're offering guided hunts. Their real concern is competition for elk and deer." Mike's tone made clear his skepticism. "They're after the permits as a way to eliminate predators they see as competition for their clients' trophies." Daniel studied the map, noting how the North Ridge Pack's territory overlapped significantly with the area in question. A cold certainty settled in his stomach. The wolves would be directly in the crosshairs if these permits were granted. "Where do I come in?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "We need documentation," Jesse explained. "Your photographs showing the wolves' natural behaviors, their family structures, their role in the ecosystem. The permit hearing is in 3 weeks, and scientific testimony helps, but nothing speaks to the public and the review board like powerful images." Daniel nodded slowly. "You want me to make a case for the wolves?" "Nobody knows that pack better than you do," Mike said. "Your camera traps have provided more data on their movements and behaviors than any other source we have, and frankly, your photographs humanize them in a way that statistics can't." The irony wasn't lost on Daniel. The Forest Service had no idea just how well he knew the North Ridge Pack, or the extraordinary bonds that had formed between them. This wasn't just about conservation or ecosystem management. It was personal in ways he could never fully explain. "I'll need access to areas that might be off limits to the general public," Daniel said, already mentally cataloging the equipment he would need. "Already arranged." Jesse handed him a special permit. "This gives you authorization to work throughout their territory, including sections that cross onto private land where we have easements." They discussed logistics for another hour, marking potential observation points on the map and reviewing recent pack sightings. By the time the rangers departed, Daniel had committed to an intensive 3-week documentation project focused exclusively on the North Ridge wolves. After seeing the Forest Service truck off, Daniel returned to Atlas, who had finally awakened from his nap and was watching with rheumy eyes. "Looks like we've got a mission, old friend," Daniel told him, kneeling to stroke the dog's graying muzzle. "Though I think this one's just for me." The sadness in this acknowledgement weighed heavily. For years, Atlas had been his constant companion in the wilderness. Now the dog's advanced age meant he would remain behind, while Daniel ventured into the forest on what might be his most important photographic assignment yet. Dawn. The following morning found Daniel deep in the North Ridge territory, his camouflage blind established near a meadow frequented by the wolf pack during their spring hunting. He had chosen to begin with traditional wildlife photography methods, concealment, patience, and distance, rather than relying on the unorthodox proximity his unique relationship might allow. For the permit hearing, he needed images that other photographers could, in theory, capture with sufficient skill and patience. The first day yielded modest results. Distant shots of 3 pack members patrolling their territory boundary, good documentation of their range, but lacking the emotional impact he sought. The second and third days were similar, providing scientifically valuable but artistically limited material. On the fourth morning, everything changed. Daniel arrived at his blind before first light, settling in for another long day of patient observation. As golden sunlight began spilling across the meadow, movement at the forest edge caught his attention. The entire North Ridge pack emerged from the trees, 11 wolves moving with the coordinated precision of a close-knit family unit. Among them, instantly recognizable despite the distance, was the mother wolf. She had aged visibly since their first encounter years ago, her muzzle showing traces of gray, her bearing that of a senior pack member, though no longer the dominant female. That role had apparently passed to one of her daughters from an earlier litter, who led the pack into the meadow with confident authority. Daniel worked with practiced efficiency, his camera capturing the wolves' movements as they spread across the open space. Through his telephoto lens, he documented behaviors rarely observed: adults regurgitating food for younger pack members, adolescents engaging in play that doubled as hunting practice, the coordinated communication that allowed the group to function as a single organism despite being spread across the meadow. Then a moment that made his breath catch. The mother wolf suddenly lifted her head, nose testing the air, body oriented directly toward Daniel's blind. Despite the distance and his careful concealment, she had somehow detected his presence. Instead of alerting the pack to potential danger, she simply gazed in his direction for several long moments before deliberately turning away to rejoin the group's activities. She remembered. More than that, she had chosen to acknowledge him without fear or alarm, accepting his presence as no threat to her family. The encounter yielded the first photographs that truly captured what Daniel hoped to convey, not just wolves as abstract elements of wilderness, but as sentient beings with complex social structures and emotional lives worthy of protection in their own right. Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel traveled throughout the pack's territory, documenting their interactions with the broader ecosystem. He photographed them hunting, confirming they primarily targeted the weak and sick among elk and deer populations, ultimately strengthening the prey herds. He captured images of wolf-killed carcasses, becoming feeding stations for dozens of other species, from ravens and eagles to bears and smaller predators. Most powerfully, he documented the pack's denning area, where this year's pups, tiny bundles of gray and tawny fur, tumbled under the watchful eyes of multiple adult wolves. These images spoke directly to the family bonds that defined wolf society, structures not so different from human families in their essence. Throughout this intensive documentation period, Daniel experienced several moments when the boundaries between observer and observed seemed to dissolve. The mother wolf appeared regularly in his vicinity, sometimes watching him work from a distance, sometimes deliberately crossing open spaces where he could easily photograph her. Once she even led two curious yearlings, perhaps her grandchildren, within 50 yards of his position, presenting them clearly for his camera before shepherding them back to the safety of the forest. It was collaboration unlike anything documented in wildlife photography. A wild predator seemingly aware of the purpose behind the human's presence, offering access that would otherwise be impossible to obtain. The night before the permit hearing, Daniel sat at his kitchen table reviewing the thousands of images he had captured. Atlas lay at his feet, the dog's breathing labored but steady, his presence a comforting constant as Daniel selected the photographs that might determine the fate of the North Ridge pack. The final collection told a complete story. Wolves as family units, wolves as ecosystem engineers, wolves as intelligent beings navigating a complex world. Some images were technically brilliant, others emotionally powerful, but collectively they presented an irrefutable case for conservation rather than control. One photograph in particular seemed to capture everything at stake. In the golden light of early morning, the mother wolf stood on a rocky outcropping overlooking her territory, her posture conveying both vigilance and belonging. In the background, barely visible but unmistakably present, were human elements. A distant road, the faint outline of ranch buildings on the horizon. The image spoke eloquently of coexistence, of shared landscapes where human and wild could both thrive if mutual respect prevailed. Daniel printed this image larger than the others, mounting it carefully as the centerpiece of his presentation. As he worked, a now familiar sound drifted through his open window. Wolf song from the North Ridge carried on the evening breeze like a reminder of what hung in the balance. Atlas lifted his head at the sound, ears moving weakly in recognition. The old dog no longer had the strength to add his voice to the chorus, but his eyes still brightened at this connection to his wild cousins. "Tomorrow we speak for them," Daniel told him, running a gentle hand over the shepherd's head. "Tomorrow we try to keep them safe." The hearing room in White River was packed beyond capacity, testament to the controversial nature of the predator control permits being considered. Ranchers and hunting outfitters filled one side of the room, conservation advocates the other, with the 5-member review board seated at the front beneath the Montana state seal. Daniel waited his turn to present, listening as speakers from both sides made impassioned arguments. The hunting outfit's representative emphasized economic benefits, potential jobs, and the traditional view of wolves as threats to livestock and game animals. Their presentation included stark photographs of elk carcasses and statistics about declining herd numbers in areas with wolf presence. When finally called forward, Daniel approached the podium with his carefully curated portfolio and a simple storytelling approach that avoided both sentimentality and excessive scientific jargon. As his images appeared on the large projection screen, a hush fell over the contentious room. "What you're seeing is not just a predator," he explained as the photographs cycled through, "but a family, multiple generations working together to survive in a landscape we all share. These wolves maintain the health of elk and deer populations. By removing the sick and weak, they distribute nutrients across the ecosystem through their kills. They maintain a balance that evolved over thousands of years." He saved the image of the mother wolf on the outcropping for last, leaving it projected as he delivered his final thoughts. "I've spent years observing this particular pack. I've witnessed their struggles and adaptations as human activities have increasingly encroached on their territory. Despite this pressure, they've consistently avoided human conflict. maintaining their distance from ranches and hunting areas when given sufficient space to exist. Daniel looked directly at the review board members. The North Ridge Pack isn't asking for exclusive rights to this landscape, just the chance to remain part of it as their ancestors have for millennia before human settlement. Our communities are enriched by their presence, both ecologically and spiritually. Their howls remind us that not everything in our world has been tamed or commodified. The room remained silent when he concluded, the power of the images still visible on the screen, perhaps communicating more effectively than his words. As he returned to his seat, Daniel noticed several board members studying the final photograph with particular intensity, their expressions thoughtful rather than dismissive. The board's deliberation lasted barely 30 minutes, unusually brief for such a controversial decision. When they returned, the chairwoman announced their verdict. Predator control permits denied, with a recommendation for further study of non-lethal conflict prevention measures in areas where wolf territories overlapped with human activities. The boar hunting outfit representatives departed in obvious frustration, while conservation advocates gathered around Daniel to express gratitude for his compelling presentation. He accepted their thanks with appropriate modesty, knowing he could never reveal the full story behind his extraordinary access to the North Ridge Pack. That evening, as sunset painted the western sky in brilliant orange and pink, Daniel drove the familiar road home with a profound sense of accomplishment. For once, he had used his voice and talents not just to document the wilderness, but to actively defend it, to protect the extraordinary beings who had repeatedly defied natural boundaries to connect with him. As he rounded the final bend toward his cabin, Daniel was startled by a dark shape at the edge of his driveway, a wolf standing in plain sight rather than concealed in the surrounding forest. Even before he brought the truck to a complete stop, he recognized her. The mother wolf made no move to flee as he slowly exited the vehicle, maintaining a respectful distance between them. Her amber eyes held that same impossible understanding. He had witnessed multiple times over the years, but now tinged with something he could only interpret as urgency. "What is it?" Daniel asked quietly, immediately alert to the abnormal behavior. Wolves, even those accustomed to human presence, rarely appeared so deliberately, especially while alone. The mother wolf turned and trotted several paces toward his cabin, then looked back expectantly. The gesture was unmistakable, the same behavior she had displayed during previous emergencies when guiding him had been necessary. Heart suddenly racing, Daniel hurried toward his cabin, the wolf moving alongside, him at a distance but clearly accompanying his progress. As the building came into view, he immediately understood her presence. Atlas lay motionless on the porch, where Daniel had left him that morning. The old dog's body curled as if sleeping but unnaturally still. The mother wolf stopped at the edge of the clearing, watching as Daniel rushed forward to confirm what he already knew in his heart. His faithful companion of 14 years had passed peacefully sometime during the day, likely watching for his return until the very end. Daniel knelt beside the shepherd's body, hands gently stroking the still warm fur as tears blurred his vision. When he finally looked up, the mother wolf remained at her position, her posture communicating a solemn attentiveness that transcended species boundaries. Somehow she had known, had perhaps sensed Atlas's passing from miles away, and had come to ensure Daniel didn't return to this discovery alone. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking on the simple words that seemed woefully inadequate for what had transpired between them over the years. The mother wolf held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned toward the forest. At the edge of the trees, she paused to look back one final time before disappearing into the gathering darkness, leaving Daniel to his grief, but having ensured he faced it knowing he was not entirely alone in the vast wilderness he called home. Seasons turned with their ancient rhythm, one year flowing into the next. Daniel buried Atlas beneath a towering pine near the cabin, marking the grave with a simple wooden plaque carved with the loyal dog's name and the words, "Faithful Friend, Bridge Between Worlds." The absence of his longtime companion left a profound emptiness in Daniel's daily life. The cabin eerily quiet, without the clicking of nails on hardwood floors or the soft breathing of the shepherd beside the wood stove. For months after Atlas's passing, Daniel threw himself into his work with uncharacteristic intensity. His photography took him farther afield, documenting wildlife across Montana's varied ecosystems, from the grasslands of the east to the rugged western peaks. The images he captured continued to gain recognition, leading to a prestigious conservation award and a commission for a coffee table book from a major publisher. Throughout this period of professional success and personal mourning, his encounters with the Northridge pack became less frequent. Occasional glimpses through his telephoto lens, distant howls carrying across mountain valleys, tracks in fresh snow. These remained his primary connections to the wolves who had so profoundly impacted his life. The mother wolf, in particular, seemed to have faded from his immediate experience, though he sometimes felt her presence in ways he couldn't easily explain. A sensation of being watched while hiking familiar trails, or the inexplicable urge to visit certain locations where pack sightings would subsequently occur. Winter arrived again, bringing the 3-year anniversary of that first extraordinary encounter during the polar vortex. On a crisp December evening, Daniel sat on his porch despite the cold, a mug of steaming coffee warming his hands as he gazed toward the Northridge. The full moon illuminated the snow-covered landscape, transforming the familiar terrain into a silver-blue dreamscape. "I miss you, old friend," he said aloud. The words meant for Atlas, but somehow expanding to encompass all the connections he had formed and lost in this remote wilderness. His dog, the wolves, perhaps even parts of himself. As if in answer, a lone howl rose from the direction of the forest edge, a single wolf voice rather than the usual chorus of the pack. Daniel set down his coffee and stood, straining to locate the source in the moonlit terrain. A dark shape moved at the edge of his vision, a grey shadow against the white snow, approaching his property with deliberate steps. The mother wolf emerged into the clearing before his cabin, her form unmistakable despite the distance and dim light. She had aged visibly in the years since their first encounter, her muzzle now predominantly grey, her movements showing the slight stiffness of advancing years. Yet she still carried herself with the dignity and purpose that had always characterized her presence. Daniel remained motionless on the porch, hardly daring to breathe as she crossed the open space toward his cabin. She moved without hurry or hesitation, her path direct and intentional. When she reached the bottom of the porch steps, she stopped, looking up at him with those familiar amber eyes that seemed to hold impossible understanding. "Hello, old friend," Daniel said softly. The wolf's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. For a long moment, they simply regarded each other across the short distance, wild and human, connected by years of improbable interactions that defied conventional understanding of the boundaries between their worlds. Then, with a soft woof that clouded the cold air, the mother wolf turned and moved toward the tree line, pausing to look back when she reached the edge of the clearing. The invitation was clear, the same behavior she had displayed in previous instances when guidance was being offered. Without hesitation, Daniel went inside to gather his coat, gloves, and flashlight. Whatever the wolf intended to show him, he would follow. Their history had taught him that much. When she sought him out, the reason was always significant. The mother wolf led him along a winding path through the moonlit forest, occasionally pausing to ensure he kept pace. Despite her age, She moved with confident familiarity through the terrain, selecting routes that accommodated his human limitations while making steady progress towards some unknown destination. After nearly an hour of hiking, they reached an elevated clearing that offered expansive views across the valley below. Daniel recognized the location from his photography expeditions, a natural viewpoint that captured the essence of Montana's wilderness beauty. The mother wolf crossed to the far edge of the clearing, where the land fell away into a steep ravine, and looked back at Daniel expectantly. As he approached, Daniel noticed what he had missed in the moonlight, a subtle disturbance in the snow near the edge, signs of activity that seemed out of place in this isolated spot. Drawing closer, he directed his flashlight beam into the ravine below and immediately understood why he had been brought here. At the bottom of the steep slope lay the crumpled form of a small aircraft, a single-engine plane that had apparently clipped the trees before crashing into the ravine. The wreckage showed no signs of fire, and the undisturbed snow surrounding it suggested the crash was recent, perhaps within the past few hours. Daniel immediately reached for his satellite phone, his fingers clumsy with cold and urgency as he dialed emergency services. While waiting for the connection, he carefully made his way down the slope toward the aircraft, the mother wolf watching from above, but making no attempt to follow. The plane's cockpit was intact, though significantly damaged. Inside, Daniel found the pilot, a middle-aged man unconscious but breathing, secured by his safety harness and protected from the worst of the impact by the aircraft's design. Blood from a head wound had frozen on his face, and his breathing was shallow, but he was alive, a survival that seemed miraculous given the remote location and harsh conditions. "This is Daniel Blackwood," he said, when the emergency dispatcher finally answered. "I've located a downed aircraft approximately 7 miles northeast of my property in the Bitterroot Range. The pilot is alive but injured and requires immediate medical evacuation." As he provided coordinates and condition details, Daniel realized the extraordinary nature of what had transpired. Without the wolf's intervention, this crash would likely have remained undiscovered until spring thaw, far too late for the injured pilot. Somehow, the mother wolf had detected the downed aircraft in her territory and made the deliberate decision to bring Daniel to the scene, understanding on some profound level that he could provide the help she could not while awaiting the rescue. Helicopter. Daniel did what he could for the pilot, securing a space blanket from his pack around the man's body, carefully clearing snow from the cockpit, monitoring vital signs. Throughout this activity, he remained intensely aware of the wolf's presence on the ridge above, her silhouette occasionally visible against the night sky as she maintained her vigilant watch. The distinctive sound of helicopter rotors finally broke the wilderness silence, growing louder as the rescue team approached the coordinates Daniel had provided. As the aircraft appeared over the ridge, spotlights cutting through the darkness to illuminate the crash site, the mother wolf slipped away into the forest, her role complete, her retreat from human machinery instinctive and wise. Daniel directed the rescue team to the downed aircraft with signal flares from his emergency kit. The medics worked efficiently to stabilize and extract the injured pilot, expressing amazement at the fortunate timing of Daniel's discovery. "How on earth did you find him out here?" the lead paramedic asked as they prepared the pilot for transport. "There's no flight plan that would have brought search teams to this area for days." Daniel hesitated, glancing toward the dark forest where his unlikely guide had disappeared. Some truths were too extraordinary for casual sharing, too sacred to be dissected by disbelieving ears. "I was photographing nocturnal wildlife," he said simply. "Just happened to be in the right place at the right time." As the helicopter lifted off with its precious cargo, Daniel remained in the clearing, watching, until the aircraft disappeared over the ridge toward the distant lights of civilization. Only then did he turn his attention back to the forest edge. searching for any sign of the mother wolf's return. She emerged from the shadows as if summoned by his thoughts, approaching with the same deliberate calm she had displayed earlier. In the moonlight, her age was more apparent. The grey muzzle, the slightly thinner frame, the careful precision of movements that had once been fluid power. Yet her eyes remained bright with that impossible intelligence that had always defined her presence in his life. "You saved him," Daniel said softly. "You knew exactly what you were doing, didn't you?" The wolf tilted her head slightly, regarding him with an expression that seemed to transcend the boundaries between their species. Then, with unexpected delicacy, she closed the distance between them, approaching closer than she had ever voluntarily come before. Daniel remained perfectly still as she circled him once, her scent enveloping him, wild and primal, yet somehow familiar after their years of extraordinary interaction. When she completed her circuit, she paused directly before him, her amber eyes meeting his with unmistakable intent. Slowly, carefully, Daniel extended his hand, palm down in the calming gesture he had used with Atlas countless times. The mother. Wolf watched the movement without retreating, her nostrils flaring slightly as she processed his scent. Then, in a moment that stopped Daniel's breath entirely, she stepped forward and briefly pressed her muzzle against his outstretched fingers. Not quite a domestic dog's nuzzle, but a deliberate contact that acknowledged their connection with unprecedented physical confirmation. The touch lasted only seconds before she withdrew, turning toward the forest with the fluid grace that had characterized her movements since their first encounter. At the tree line, she paused for a final look back, a gesture Daniel had come to recognize as her signature farewell. "Thank you," he called softly, the simple words carrying the weight of years of extraordinary encounters and mutual aid that had transcended the natural boundaries between their kinds. The mother wolf disappeared into the darkness, leaving Daniel alone in the moonlit clearing, with the knowledge that something profound had just culminated. A circle completed, a bond, acknowledged in the most direct way possible between wild and human. As he made his way back toward his cabin through the silent winter forest, Daniel felt a sense of completion that had eluded him since Atlas's passing. The wolf's touch, that brief, miraculous contact between wild predator and human hand, had somehow bridged the emptiness, reminding him that connection transcended loss, that the boundaries between species were perhaps more permeable than humanity had allowed itself to believe. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns as Daniel walked, his path illuminated by moonlight reflecting off pristine snow. From somewhere deep in the forest came the sound of wolf song, the entire pack joining voices in that primordial harmony that had echoed across these mountains long before human settlement, and would, with sufficient wisdom and respect, continue long after. Daniel paused to listen, recognizing the mother wolf's distinctive voice among the chorus. Still strong, still vital, still very much the heart of her family, despite the passing years. In that moment, he understood that what had transpired between them over these extraordinary years was neither accident nor anomaly, but perhaps a glimpse of what was possible when the artificial barriers between human and wild were temporarily suspended. As the howling faded into the vast silence of the winter night, Daniel continued toward the warm lights of his cabin, carrying with him the touch of the wild and the knowledge that some connections transcend understanding, existing in that mysterious borderland where human and wolf, domesticated and wild, briefly recognize something shared across the evolutionary divide that both separates and unites them. 5 years later, Daniel received an invitation to present his wildlife photography at a major conservation conference in Seattle. Among the attendees was the pilot whose life he had saved, now the head of a wildlife protection foundation that had successfully established protective corridors for wolf migration throughout the northern Rockies. During his presentation, Daniel shared the image that had become his most famous work, a distant shot of a silver-muzzled wolf standing on a ridge at sunrise, her amber eyes somehow finding the camera despite the distance. He never publicly revealed the full story of his connection with the North Ridge Pack. Some relationships existed beyond words, beyond explanation. When he returned to his cabin that spring, he found fresh wolf tracks leading to his porch. At the top step lay a single wolf fur, silver gray, shed naturally during the seasonal coat change. Daniel knew immediately. She was gone, having lived her full natural lifespan, but had left this final token as bridge between their worlds. That night, a new voice led the howling from the North Ridge, her daughter or granddaughter perhaps, carrying forward the extraordinary genetic legacy of a wolf who had once dared to trust a human during a deadly winter storm. Some bonds, Daniel realized, transcend even death, connecting generations in ways that defy human understanding but enrich the world beyond measure.